They called him crazy. They whispered that he was harboring a killing machine right there inside his own cabin. And the truth is, they were right. Elias Thorne had spent 30 years wearing a badge, strictly enforcing the laws of the wild. But in his twilight years, he broke every single rule in the book for one simple reason: a blind, dying dog and her impossible choice. What happens when a gentle golden retriever decides to adopt a wild African lion as her own puppy? Elias chose to hide the beast beneath his floorboards, praying that love would be enough to rewrite nature. But he forgot the one rule the wilderness never breaks. You can take the lion out of the wild, but you can never take the killer out of the lion. The winter wind in Montana doesn't just blow, it screams. It cuts through layers of wool and flannel, seeking out old injuries and deep regrets. For Elias Thorne, a man whose knees creaked in sympathy with the floorboards of his cabin, the blizzard was just another reminder that the world had turned cold a long time ago. At 68, Elias was a man made of hard edges and silence. 30 years as a park ranger had he taught him that nature was beautiful but indifferent. It didn't care if you lived or died. It only cared about balance. Since his forced retirement, Elias had become part of that indifference. He lived alone at the edge of the tree line, his only companion a 13-year-old golden retriever named Sadie. Sadie was like him, slowing down, her muzzle frosted with white age, one eye clouded by a cataract. They were two relics waiting for the final snow. The storm had raged for 2 days, and when it finally broke, the silence that followed was deafening. Elias leashed Sadie, grabbed his rifle out of habit, and stepped out to check the perimeter. The drifts were hip-deep. They found the wreckage a mile from the main road, hidden in a ravine. It wasn't a hiking accident. It was an unmarked cargo truck that had skidded off the ice and shattered against the pines. The driver was gone, fled or rescued. Elias didn't care. What mattered was the cargo. Cages. Shattered wooden crates scattered like matchsticks. Most were empty, their contents long dead from the exposure. "Easy, girl," Elias murmured, his hand tightening on the leash. Sadie had stopped. Her ears, usually drooping, were perked forward. She wasn't growling, she was whining, a high-pitched sound of distress that Elias hadn't heard since she was a puppy. She pulled him toward a hollow beneath the twisted roots of a fallen hemlock. Elias plowed through the snow, cursing his stiff joints. He expected to find a wounded coyote or perhaps a bobcat. He raised his rifle, clicking the safety off. In these woods, mercy often looked like a quick bullet. But when he parted the branches, he froze. It wasn't a bobcat. It was a ball of tawny fur, spotted with the faint rosettes of infancy, no bigger than a house cat. A lion cub. Here, in the freezing hell of the American Northwest, it was absurd, it was impossible, and it was dying. The creature was stiff, its breathing so shallow it barely melted the snowflakes landing on its nose. "Illegal transport," Elias grunted, the anger flaring hot in his chest. "Damn fools." Protocol was clear. Call the station, report the invasive species. Wait for them to come and dispose of the problem. A tropical predator couldn't survive here, and no zoo would take an undocumented animal with potential diseases. To call it in was to sign its death warrant. Elias reached for his radio. It was the right thing to do, the lawful thing. Sadie didn't care about the law. With a strength she hadn't possessed in years, she yanked the leash from Elias's frozen grip. She didn't attack. She limped forward and collapsed into the snow, wrapping her warm, thick, golden body around the freezing cub. She began to lick its face, rough, frantic strokes against the ice-cold fur. "Sadie, get back," Elias barked. "That's a predator." Sadie ignored him. She let out a low, warning rumble, not at the cub, but at Elias. It was the first time in her life she had ever defied him. The old dog was pouring every ounce of her remaining heat into the small, foreign creature. Elias stood there, the radio heavy in his hand. He looked at the gray sky, then at the rifle, and finally at the dog, who was trying to save a life that logic said was already lost. The cub let out a tiny, mewling sound, instinctively burrowing into Sadie's golden flank. Elias cursed under his breath, a long string of expletives that vanished into the wind. He shoved the radio back into his pocket and slung the rifle over his shoulder. He bent down, scooping the cub up. It was dangerously light. Sadie scrambled up immediately, nudging Elias's leg, her tail giving a tentative, hopeful thump. "Don't look at me like that," Elias muttered to the dog, tucking the cub inside his heavy coat against his flannel shirt. "Just for tonight. Tomorrow we call the sheriff." Back in the cabin, the warmth of the wood stove hit them like a physical blow. Elias set the cub on the rug. It was barely conscious. He warmed some goat milk using an old eyedropper he kept for emergencies. While he worked, Sadie never left the cub's side. She groomed it obsessively, cleaning the mud and ice from its coat, her maternal instinct overriding biology, geography, and species. As night fell, Elias sat in his armchair, watching them. The cub had stopped shivering. It was asleep, its head resting on Sadie's paws. The old dog watched over it with her good eye, breathing deeply, looking more content than she had in years. Elias reached for the remote and turned on the small TV in the corner, keeping the volume low. The local news anchor looked grave. "Authorities are warning residents of Park County to stay indoors. A suspected smuggling transport crashed earlier today. Police believe several exotic and dangerous animals may be loose in the area. These are wild predators, and the Sheriff's Department has issued a shoot-on-sight order for public safety." Elias looked at the screen, then down at the floor. The dangerous predator twitched in its sleep, letting out a soft hiccup. Sadie looked up at Elias, her tail tapping a slow rhythm on the floorboards. Elias stood up, walked to the window, and pulled the heavy curtains shut. He went to the door and engaged the deadbolt. Then he walked over to the phone on the wall, took the receiver off the hook, and left it dangling. There would be no call tomorrow. Winter thawed into a muddy, reluctant spring, and the secret in Elias Thorne's cabin grew, literally. Atlas was no longer a trembling ball of fluff. At 4 months old, he was a 40-pound accumulation of oversized paws, loose skin, and boundless, clumsy energy. But the strange thing wasn't his size. It was his soul. Atlas didn't know he was a lion. He had opened his eyes to the world and seen Sadie, and in his mind he was simply a very large, very awkward golden retriever. He mimicked her with a dedication that was both hilarious and heartbreaking. When Sadie trotted to the door to be let out, Atlas would stumble behind her, his gait a rolling, heavy-shouldered lilt that was nothing like a dog's brisk step. When Sadie wagged her tail, Atlas would attempt to do the same, though his tail was a stiff, tufted rope that whipped through the air like a lash, knocking over boots, broomsticks, and on one occasion a cast-iron skillet. He didn't purr and he couldn't bark. Instead, when he was happy, usually when Elias was scratching him behind the ears, he emitted a deep, rhythmic chuffing sound, like a steam engine idling in the next room. "You're a confused mess, you know that," Elias would grumble, sitting on the floorboards. But the harshness had left his voice. The solitude that had wrapped around Elias like a shroud was fraying. He found himself rushing home from his supply runs, not out of duty, but out of anticipation. Sadie took her role as matriarch seriously. She was the teacher of the dog's way. She taught Atlas that shoes were for chewing, until Elias scolded them, that the rug by the fire was neutral ground, and most importantly, she taught him gentleness. One evening, while wrestling over a rope toy, Atlas got too excited. His claws, now retractable switchblades, slid out. He swiped, and a line of red appeared on Sadie's nose. Sadie didn't attack. She simply dropped the toy, let out a sharp, high-pitched yelp, and turned her back on him. It was the ultimate punishment. Atlas was devastated. He whined, a strange, chirping sound, and nudged her shoulder with his head, keeping his claws sheathed tight, apologizing until she finally licked his forehead. He learned a lesson that day that nature never intended for a lion: restraint. But the outside world was scratching at the door. It started with the crunch of gravel in the driveway. Elias was in the kitchen when he saw the flash of the sheriff's decal through the window. "Basement!" Elias hissed. It was a drill they had practiced. Elias opened the trap door hidden beneath the hallway rug. Sadie knew the command. She hobbled down the stairs, and Atlas, thinking it was a game, tumbled after her. Elias slammed the door shut and threw the rug over it just as the heavy knock rattled the front door. It was Deputy Cale, Elias's nephew. A good kid, sharp-jawed and eager, wearing the uniform with a pride Elias remembered feeling a lifetime ago. "Uncle Eli," Cale said, stepping inside, stomping mud off his boots, "checking in. Haven't seen you in town much." "I'm retired, Cale, not dead," Elias said, leaning against the hallway wall, placing himself directly over the trap door. He could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. Atlas was moving down there. Cale laughed, walking into the kitchen. "Right, listen, I wanted to warn you. We found tracks up by the ridge. Big ones. That cat from the crash. We think it survived the winter. It's growing." Elias felt a bead of cold sweat trickle down his spine. "Probably a cougar, Cale. You city boys get spooked by shadows." "This isn't a cougar," Cale said, his voice dropping. He picked up a dog toy from the floor, a heavy-duty rubber tire that was chewed almost in half. He frowned, turning it over in his hands. "Sadie do this?" Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. Sadie's teeth were old. She could barely chew kibble, let alone shred industrial rubber. "She got a burst of energy. Must be the spring air." Cale looked at the toy, then at Elias. For a second, the air in the room grew thin. Then Cale shrugged and tossed the tire back. "Strong old girl. Anyway, keep your rifle handy. If that beast is out there, it's hungry. And it's a killer, Uncle. It's in the blood." When Cale finally left, Elias locked the door and slumped against it, his legs shaking. He let them out. Atlas bounded up, looking for a treat, oblivious that the man who had just left wanted to put a bullet in him. Elias looked at the lion, who was now rubbing his massive head against Elias's thigh, and felt a terrifying realization. He isn't a killer. He's just a boy. But the world will never see that. The true test of nature versus nurture came 2 weeks later. Elias was chopping wood in the side yard. Sadie was napping on the porch. Atlas was inside, watching through the large picture window. A mule deer buck, confused by the early thaw, wandered into the clearing. It was close, maybe 20 feet from the house. Inside, something snapped in Atlas. Elias saw it happen through the glass. Atlas didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. He went rigid. His ears flattened against his skull. The playful, clumsy puppy vanished. In his place was a predator designed by millions of years of evolution. His shoulders lowered, muscles bunching like coiled steel. His pupils dilated, until his eyes were black voids. Atlas launched himself. Thud. He hit the reinforced glass with terrifying force. The window shuddered, but held. The deer bolted instantly. But Atlas didn't stop. He was scrabbling at the glass, letting out a sound Elias had never heard before, a guttural, vibrating growl that seemed to come from the center of the earth. It wasn't the sound of a pet. It was the sound of the Serengeti. "Atlas, no! Elias shouted, dropping his axe and running toward the porch. But it wasn't Elias who stopped him. Sadie had woken up. She saw the change in her boy. She barked, a sharp, authoritative command. She limped to the window, placing herself between the glass and the frantic lion. She stared at him, eye to eye, through the reflection. Atlas froze. He looked at the fleeing deer, then at the old doe. He was panting, drool dripping from his jowls, his claws extended, scratching grooves into the windowsill. The red haze of instinct was battling the golden light of his upbringing. Slowly, agonizingly, the tension left his frame. The black pupils shrank back to amber. He blinked, looking confused, as if waking from a trance. He looked at Sadie, let out a soft, apologetic chuff, and licked the glass where her nose was. Elias stood in the yard, breath pluming in the cold air. He had seen the monster Cale talked about. It was in there, buried deep. But he had also seen the miracle. The lion had chosen the dog over the hunt. But as Elias looked at the scratches on the window frame, deep gouges that no dog could make, he knew time was running out. The basement was getting too small, and the lie was getting too big. Summer hit Montana like a fever. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, leaving the valley floor baked in dust and pine resin. For Elias, the heat brought a new enemy: smell. 150-pound adolescent lion didn't smell like a house cat. He smelled of musk and wild meat. Elias spent his days burning sage and cedar in the fireplace, trying to mask the scent of the savanna that permeated his living room. But the real danger wasn't the smell, it was the hunger. Atlas was eating 10 pounds of meat a day. Elias's pension was gone. His savings were bleeding out at the local butcher shop in town. "You got a pack of wolves up there, Eli?" Mr. Henderson, the butcher, asked as he wrapped 20 pounds of beef scraps and organ meat in white paper. His eyes were narrow, curious. "Sadie's got an appetite in her old age," Elias lied, the words tasting like ash. He paid in cash, grabbed the heavy bundle, and walked out. He didn't notice the black pickup truck idling across the street. He didn't see the man behind the wheel, a man with a scar running through his eyebrow, watching Elias struggle with the weight of the meat. Vargo had been looking for his lost shipment for 8 months. He knew the crash site was empty. He knew someone had taken the prize. And now he knew who was buying enough meat to feed a king. 2 days later, Elias had to drive into the county seat to argue with the bank about a loan. He left Atlas in the reinforced basement and Sadie on the porch guarding the house. It was a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Vargo didn't wait for nightfall. He parked his truck a mile down the logging road and hiked in. He carried a modified tranquilizer rifle and a catch pole. He wasn't here to kill. A dead lion was worth a pelt, but a live African lion on the black market was worth a retirement fund. He reached the cabin around noon. The heat was stifling. He kicked the front door open, the lock splintering easily. Sadie was asleep on the cool linoleum of the kitchen. She woke with a start, her cloudy eyes trying to focus on the intruder. Vargo ignored her. He moved toward the heavy rug in the hallway, the one that covered the trapdoor. He could smell it now, the distinct heavy musk of the cat. "Jackpot," he whispered. He reached for the rug. Sadie didn't bark. She didn't growl. She moved with a speed that defied her 13 years. She knew this man was bad. She knew he was a threat to the boy downstairs. She launched herself, her old teeth sinking into Vargo's heavy boot. "Get off," Vargo shouted, stumbling. He swung his heavy boot, catching Sadie in the ribs. The sound was sickening, a dry snap like a breaking branch. Sadie yelped, a sound of pure pain, and slid across the floor, slamming into the baseboards. She tried to stand, but her back legs collapsed. She let out a low whine, not for herself, but a warning. But the warning wasn't needed. The floorboards vibrated. The trap door didn't just open, it exploded upwards. Atlas had heard the yelp. Vargo barely had time to raise his rifle. He didn't see a clumsy puppy. He saw a golden blur of muscle and rage. Atlas cleared the stairs in a single bound. He didn't roar. True hunters are silent until the strike. Vargo pulled the trigger, but the shot went wide, shattering a vase on the mantel. Then 400 pounds of force hit him in the chest. Vargo flew backward, crashing through the coffee table, the rifle skittering away. Before he could draw a breath, a paw the size of a dinner plate pinned his chest to the floor. Claws, sharp as razors, extended, piercing his jacket and pricking the skin over his heart. Vargo froze. He looked up, and terror stopped his heart. The lion's face was inches from his. Hot breath, smelling of raw beef, washed over him. Atlas pulled his lips back, revealing canines that could crush a human skull like a grape. A low, rumbling growl started deep in the lion's chest, vibrating through Vargo's own ribs. Atlas wanted to kill. The instinct screamed at him to tear the throat out of this threat. The bloodlust was a red haze in his vision. But then a sound cut through the red. A whimper. Atlas's ears swiveled. He looked over his shoulder. Sadie was dragging herself across the floor, leaving a trail of urine and blood. She wasn't looking at Vargo. She was looking at Atlas. She gave a soft, broken woof. Restraint. Atlas turned back to Vargo. He didn't bite. He roared, a sound so loud it rattled the window panes, right into Vargo's face, covering the man in spittle. But he didn't close his jaws. He held him there, pinned, waiting. That was how Elias found them. The truck screeched into the yard. Elias ran in, his service revolver drawn, expecting to find his dog dead and a monster loose. He stopped in the doorway. The scene was a nightmare. His house was wrecked. A stranger was pinned to the floor. And on top of him was a beast. For a split second, Elias didn't see Atlas, the boy who liked belly rubs. He saw a wild African lion about to disembowel a man. The fear that he had suppressed for months, the fear of the wild, took over. "Atlas, back!" Elias screamed, raising the gun. He leveled the sights right between the lion's eyes. His finger tightened on the trigger. Atlas froze. He looked up at Elias. The amber eyes met the human's. There was no aggression in them anymore, only confusion. "I stopped him, Papa. I saved us." "Back away!" Elias yelled again, his voice cracking, the gun shaking in his hand. "Get back, or I swear to God I'll drop you." The betrayal hit Atlas harder than a bullet. The man who fed him, the man who groomed him, was pointing the death stick at him. The scent of Elias's fear was pungent. Slowly, Atlas removed his heavy paw from Vargo's chest. He lowered his head, his ears flattening in submission. He backed away, step by step, making himself small, retreating until his haunches hit the far wall. He looked at Elias, then at the gun, and let out a soft, confused chuff. Elias kept the gun trained on the lion, kicking Vargo's rifle away with his foot. He looked down at the smuggler, then over at Sadie, who was gasping for air in the corner. Elias lowered the gun, but the damage was done. He saw it in Atlas's eyes. The trust was broken. The family was broken. The dog's way had saved Vargo's life, but Elias's fear had just killed the boy inside the beast. "You," Elias whispered to the gasping Vargo, keeping one eye on the terrified lion. "You just ended the world." Elias didn't kill Vargo. He did something worse for a man in that line of work. He left him alive, zip-tied to the radiator, with a glove compartment full of forged transport papers scattered across his chest. When Deputy Kael arrived an hour later, responding to an anonymous call, he would find the career-making bust he'd always wanted. He would also find an empty house, tire tracks peeling out of the driveway, and the lingering scent of a zoo. The 1988 Ford pickup rattled down the interstate, a ghost running through the night. In the cab, Sadie lay on the bench seat, her breathing shallow, ribs wrapped in makeshift bandages. In the covered bed of the truck, hidden beneath a tarp and crates of apples, was a king in exile. They drove for 12 hours straight, crossing state lines, putting the mountains of Montana in the rearview mirror. Elias didn't stop for coffee. He didn't stop for gas until the needle was buried past empty. He drove with the desperation of a man who knew he was hauling his own heart to the chopping block. They reached the sanctuary at dawn, a vast fenced reserve in Colorado funded by private donors who didn't ask questions about where the animals came from, only that they needed a home. The handover was brutal in its efficiency. The sanctuary director, a woman with skin like leather and eyes like flint, unlocked the double gates. "Back the truck up," she said. "We'll take it from here." Elias lowered the tailgate. Atlas blinked in the sudden morning light. He looked huge, majestic, and utterly terrified. He sniffed the air, sagebrush and unfamiliar cats. He didn't move. He turned his massive head toward the cab of the truck, letting out a low, questioning whine. He wanted Sadie. Elias walked to the back. He grabbed the old, calm-smelling blanket Sadie had slept on for a decade, the one Atlas had dragged around like a security object. He tossed it onto the grass inside the enclosure. "Go on," Elias croaked. His voice was shards of glass. Atlas stepped down, following the scent of the blanket. But as soon as his paws hit the dust, he spun around. He tried to jump back into the truck. He wasn't a lion reclaiming his kingdom. He was a confused boy being kicked out of the only home he knew. Elias slammed the tailgate shut. The metal clang rang out like a gunshot. "Get out of here!" Elias shouted, slapping the metal. "Go! You don't belong with us!" Atlas flinched. He looked at Elias, the man who had bottle-fed him, the man who had just pointed a gun at him yesterday, and who was now screaming at him. The betrayal was complete. Atlas let out a huff of resignation, picked up Sadie's blanket in his jaws, and turned toward the rising sun. He walked away, his gait heavy with a sorrow that no animal should have to feel. 1 year later, the winter came early to Montana again. Elias stood in the backyard, leaning on a shovel. The small wooden cross was already dusting over with snow. Sadie, 2011-2024, the best girl. The cabin was silent. No chuffing sounds from the basement. No click-clack of claws on the hardwood. Just the wind. Elias had paid his fines, settled his debts, and grown old in the quiet. He went inside and opened his laptop, a piece of technology he rarely used. There was an email from the sanctuary director. Subject: The King. Elias clicked the video attachment. The footage was grainy, taken from a long-range field camera. It showed a pride of lions lounging on a rocky outcrop. In the center lay Atlas. He was magnificent, a full dark mane framing a face that held a strange, solemn wisdom. He was the alpha. Then, movement at the edge of the frame. A stray coyote, mangy and desperate, had wandered into the enclosure, likely chasing a rabbit. The lionesses rose instantly, their ears pinned back. They moved in a coordinated flank, ready to tear the intruder apart. The coyote cowered, trapped against the fence, bracing for death. Suddenly, a golden blur intercepted the attack. It was Atlas. He roared, a sound that shook the camera microphone, and stepped between the females and the coyote. The lionesses stopped, confused. Atlas turned to the trembling coyote. He didn't strike. He didn't kill. He lowered his massive head and nudged the coyote's shoulder, a gentle, forceful shove toward the gap in the fence. "Go, live." Elias watched the screen, tears cutting hot tracks through the wrinkles on his face. He saw the tilt of the head. He saw the restraint. he saw the ghost of a blind, three-legged golden retriever living on in the body of an African king. "That's a good boy," Elias whispered to the empty room. "That's a good boy." Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.